Welcome to Podkey Slopcast, where voice AI, coding models, and release races get pressure tested. A lot of this week's AI chatter boils down to one question: what actually changes when models get fast enough, cheap enough, and smooth enough to feel less like software and more like a collaborator? That sounds like hype until you separate the demos from the mechanics and ask where the trade-offs really move. The biggest conceptual shift here is full-duplex voice. GPT-Live is described as listening and speaking at the same time, making interaction decisions many times per second instead of waiting for a clean stop, then replying in turns. If that holds up in practice, it matters, because a lot of what makes current voice assistants feel robotic is turn-taking friction. You pause too long, it cuts in; you keep talking, it misses the point. Full-duplex aims at that exact bottleneck. There's also an architectural claim under the hood. A conversational front end handles the live exchange, while deeper reasoning can be handed off to a stronger model like GPT 5.6 without breaking the flow. That separation is important. It suggests the system doesn't need the smartest model to be the one doing every millisecond of speech interaction. It can use a fast layer for timing and social smoothness, then escalate when the task needs heavier reasoning. The strongest argument for this approach is that speech carries context people usually strip out when typing. Rambling, hesitation, self-correction, even tone can reveal uncertainty, priorities, and what the user is actually asking for. That said, richer input is not automatically better understanding. More signal can also mean more noise. A model still has to decide what is meaningful disfluency and what is just filler. The promise is plausible, but it depends on whether the system gets better at interpretation instead of merely collecting more raw context. Early adopters pointing to language learning, translation, weather, stocks, and scheduling make sense because those are tasks where latency and natural back and forth matter as much as raw intelligence. If a system feels interruptible and responsive, users forgive some mistakes they would not forgive in a static text interface. The larger claim is that once AI can interrupt naturally, catch hesitation, and respond with emotional timing, it starts moving from a tool paradigm toward a relationship paradigm. That sounds grand, but there's a real behavioral point inside it. People coordinate more through conversation than forms. If voice becomes reliable enough, knowledge workers may offload quick planning, triage, drafting, and retrieval into spoken interaction, because talking is lower friction than composing perfect prompts. The missing context is whether that creates better outcomes or just more dependency. A primary coordination channel is powerful, but it also means more ambient AI presence in work and daily life, with all the usual concerns around trust, privacy, and over-reliance hanging in the background even when they are not the headline. On coding, the notable claim is not simply that Grok 4.5 is strong, but that it reportedly matches Opus 4.8 and GPT-5 on raw performance while costing about a third as much per task on the Artificial Analysis Index. If that benchmark is representative, the practical story is pretty straightforward. Once performance is close, cost starts driving behavior. Teams do not buy abstract model prestige, they buy useful output per dollar. Grok's edge is framed as agentic work in large code bases and multi-repo workflows, plus the top automation bench score at 51.4% success while using fewer tokens than competitors. That combination matters more than leaderboard theatre, because real production coding is rarely one isolated function. It is navigation, context management, dependency tracing, and not getting lost across a messy code base. Still, a 51.4% success rate should be heard carefully. Highest in a benchmark does not mean broadly autonomous software engineering. It means the frontier is advancing, but there is still a large failure band where oversight remains essential. The lower token consumption is easy to overlook, but it may be one of the biggest economic levers. Fewer tokens can mean lower cost, lower latency, and potentially less context bloat, which compounds in production workflows. Related to that, Cognition SWE 1.7 is getting attention for inference speed so extreme that users describe it as faster than they can visually track. That kind of reaction is anecdotal, but the underlying point is credible. Speed changes what people attempt. When latency collapses, interactive coding becomes less like waiting on a batch job and more like thinking with a partner. You ask more questions, branch more often, and keep the model inside the loop instead of only calling it for big expensive moments. The research claims around multi-region training, self-compaction, and entropy collapse handling point to something broader. They imply there is still room to improve efficiency before the field hits a hard pre-training wall. That does not prove limitless scaling, but it does undercut the tidy narrative that progress now has to come only from more compute. Better training and inference systems can still move the frontier a lot. There's also a useful correction to one-dimensional model rankings in the GPT 5.6 versus Fable 5 comparison. GPT 5.6 is described as brisk and task-driven, while Fable 5 is framed as deeper but more verbose. That sounds like branding until you look at task fit. For needle-in-a-haystack public law research, GPT 5.6 reportedly outperforms Fable. For marketers, it can one-shot strong emails that earlier models struggled to produce. Those examples support a real pattern. Speed and concision are not shallow by definition. Sometimes the valuable thing is finding the exact clause, the exact angle, the exact usable draft without making the user dig through a beautiful essay. On the other hand, a more expansive model may still be better when the task genuinely benefits from synthesis, nuance, or exploring multiple frames before narrowing down. Verbosity is only a flaw when it fails to add signal. So the trade-off is less about which model is smarter in the abstract and more about interaction cost. How much output does the user need to inspect, edit, and steer before it becomes useful? That is why the best supported takeaway here is conditional rather than tribal. If the job rewards fast targeted retrieval and decisive drafts, GPT 5.6's profile looks stronger. If the job rewards expansive reasoning, a slower and more verbose model may still earn its keep. Finally, the GPT-6 leak cycle. The headline is that it could arrive within weeks, which would be much faster than the historical roughly annual cadence and potentially ahead of Anthropic's planned Fable 5.1. Right now, that is leak territory, not confirmed release policy, so the timing should be treated cautiously. But even as a signal, it points to a more aggressive competitive tempo among frontier labs. There's a tension here. Faster internal development can create pressure to ship, but analysts also note that government scrutiny could slow public rollout. Those are not contradictory forces. They can both be true at once. In fact, the second-order effect of rapid progress may be that technical acceleration and deployment friction rise together. Labs get better at making models, while regulators and public institutions get more nervous about what faster capability jumps might mean. So the smart read is not simply that the cadence is accelerating forever, it is that the race is intensifying, and whether users feel that as constant public releases depends not just on engineering, but on governance, risk tolerance, and strategic timing. The through line across all of this is that speed, voice, and cost are no longer side details. They're shaping what kinds of work AI can realistically absorb. Thanks for listening to Podkey Slopcast. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.